So you're in the right place if you're here to see this presentation on what's new in FusionReactor 7 and 7.1. And my name is Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. I just want to back up and introduce that I don't work for the company Integral that makes FusionReactor, but I'm an independent consultant, and I focus on server troubleshooting, and I've been using FusionReactor for 10 years, and I've been working really closely with the folks for all those 10 years. They're really great people, and I enjoy supporting and assisting and evangelizing in the use of FusionReactor, helping them and helping everybody who uses it. So we'll just start with a quick introduction, and I apologize that slide's not missing a point. It's just one of the mornings. You'll see what the rest of the agenda is in a moment. But as for this introduction, I want to say that the talk is presumed, you as the audience are presumed to already be using FusionReactor, and you may or may not be using FusionReactor 7 or 7.1. And if you are using it, maybe you're not using the latest features to their fullest extent, and that's what I want to hope to achieve today. And if you're still on FusionReactor 6 or earlier, maybe you're wondering what's new in the latest releases, and you're going to get that out of this presentation as well. And even if you may be new to FusionReactor entirely, that's okay. You should be able to follow along. But I want to clarify, there are other FusionReactor webinars that talk about getting started and talk about specific types of troubleshooting and using particular features. So this is not a how do you get started with FusionReactor at all. I'm going to dive right in under the presumption that people already know what it is and how its features work, and I'm just going to talk about what's new about them. So again, if you're relatively new, or if you see something and you go, oh man, I didn't know it even did that, and it's not new, then just look for the webinars. And at the end of this presentation, I'll give you a link to the webinars, but you could also just Google FusionReactor webinars and it'll come up as the first result. I also like to always point out in these talks that the concepts I discuss here apply generally to any Java or CFML server which FusionReactor can monitor. So I might show or indicate or discuss something relative to, say, Cold Fusion. Well, if you're running Lucy or Rilo or Blue Dragon, it applies to you as well. Those are other CFML servers. And if you're using Tomcat or Jetty or JBoss or Wildfly or Glassfish, it applies to those as well. So, and finally, as you saw, the presentation is being recorded, and you can come back and watch the recording to see some details that perhaps slipped by quickly. And that recording URL will be offered on that website, that webinars page, shortly after we're done, perhaps tomorrow. Okay, so let me just give you some level setting up front so you know where things are coming from. FusionReactor 7 came out just last year in July, and 7.1 came out just a few months later in October. And I'm going to describe things as they're available now in 7.1. Sometimes I'll point out if something was new in 7 specifically, just in case that may help some of you who are still on 7 and not yet up to 7.1. I'm going to talk in a moment about updating to 7.1 or to 7 if you're on 6 or earlier. I also want to point out that there's not only new features in 7 and 7.1, but there's also improvements to existing features. And we're going to cover many of these, not all of them. We don't have time to cover everything, but we'll cover many of these new and improved features in this presentation. And we'll also mention briefly towards the end how FusionReactor 7 marked the production release of another adjunct product called FusionReactor Cloud. And if you're not familiar with that, we'll talk briefly about that at the end. And I'll point out as well that there was a whole webinar on FusionReactor Cloud earlier in 2017. So again, if it's new to you and you get intrigued by what you see and you want to learn more, then again, check out that webinar for more on just the cloud. Now, as for upgrading to FusionReactor 7.1 or 7 if you're on an earlier one, users with a current FusionReactor 7 subscription or paid maintenance can upgrade to 7.1 for free. And actually, now that I think about it, if you're on FusionReactor 6 subscription and paid maintenance, you'd be able to upgrade to 7 and 7.1 for free. If you installed FusionReactor using the available installer, then all you got to do is download and run that installer, and it updates your current release of 7 into 7.1 or 6 into 7 or 7.1. It's very straightforward to do that. And if you happen to implement FusionReactor by getting the jar file, then all you got to do is go download and put in place the new 7.1 jar. So it's really very simple to upgrade to 7.1. And just finally, I'll say that as for 7.0, the last update to that was called 7.08. Now, I point that out because sometimes people are still running on 7.0 and never got around to updating it. They might be on the original 7.0 release. So you could go up to 7.08, or you could come on up to 7.1. And there's currently just a 7.1.0. That's the current and only available release of 7.1. Just look really quick at the question, see if there's anything outstanding. Nope, good. All right. So as I said, 7 and 7.1 added many new features, and among those that we're going to have time to discuss today are something called CPU profiling. Now, some of you may know that FusionReactor had already had request profiling. This adds CPU profiling, or the CPU sampler as it's labeled in the interface, and we'll see that and talk about that. There's also a new capability to visualize threads, and that can be helpful because sometimes you're having troubles in a way where you can't see what's going on in the requests, but maybe there's some underlying Java threads that are an issue. So there is a Java thread visualization tool. And you'll even see how it may be possible for you to leverage it to understand something about your requests. So even if you're running, let's say, ColdFusion and you're looking at CFML requests, there's ways you can see in the thread visualizer your CF requests and Java JSP requests and so on. There's also, in addition to CPU profiling, there's now memory, or specifically heap profiling, and that's pretty cool for people that have long wanted to be able to dig into the heap and see what's using heap and so on. So we'll show you how that works now in FusionReactor 7. And there's also now JMX metric monitoring. Now, I'm sure some of you know exactly what that is, but others have never even heard of it and didn't know there was a thing called JMX. And so it's Java management extensions, and it's a way to look at different kinds of underlying metrics in your JVM, in your application server. So in ColdFusion, which on 10 and above is Tomcat, and on 9 and earlier was JRun, or whatever Java application server you've deployed on. They all support JMX, and it's that FusionReactor now gives you direct insight into those JMX metrics. And that can be very helpful because there's some things that might be tracked at a JMX level that perhaps have not previously been exposed in FusionReactor's interface. And then lastly, among the new features is Amazon Web Services integration with their CloudWatch service. So CloudWatch is a Amazon or AWS specific monitoring mechanism. And primarily folks would use it to monitor AWS instances, but you can send anything to CloudWatch, and CloudWatch has some capabilities to do things that you might think, oh, that'd be cool if I could have CloudWatch seeing what's going on inside of my monitored instance. FusionReactor can send tremendous amounts of information out to CloudWatch. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, one more thing I want to say before we move on to actually showing you the examples, and this is an important point that I want everybody to understand. Some of you watching this might be kind of yawning and going, CPU profiling, heap profiling, JMX, I can get that from any Java tool. I don't need FusionReactor to give me that. And you'd be right. These things are available through JVM tools. But first of all, FusionReactor gives access to them through your browser. You don't have to install the tool. You don't have to figure out how the tool works. FusionReactor just provides it in the interface. And also very important is you don't need to do any special JVM configuration. You don't have to open any special ports like the RMI ports to be able to expose JMX if you're not on the same machine as that server you're monitoring. And often there's other troubles where if the service you're running or the application you're running is running as a service, it's even more complicated to be able to use these tools to monitor a service. Well, FusionReactor just does away with all those challenges. It's all in the browser, and there's no JVM tweaks you need to do to get these features to work. They just work in FusionReactor's interface. Now, I will say quickly, I didn't think to put a point here, but let me get this out before I forget. Some of you may be looking for this in your FusionReactor 7 or 7.1 setups. Some of these features, you may be looking on the left to find them. We'll see the screenshots and demos in a moment, and you may see that they're not there for you. Some of these are only in what's called the Ultimate edition of FusionReactor. There's 3 editions, Ultimate, Enterprise, and Standard. And some of the features are only in Ultimate, and some may only be in Enterprise. And then some are in Standard. Now, I want to say before I move on to off this topic about interacting with these things through the web browser instead of through a JVM tool, somebody might go, "Oh, it's in the web browser. Isn't that a security risk?" Well, FusionReactor as a web app is secure. Of course, it requires a login. You've got to be able to log in to access FusionReactor. And you guys have probably noticed that FusionReactor's built-in web server uses non-standard ports like 8088 and 8089 and so on. So if you have access to FusionReactor only through those ports, then your firewall is going to block access to these things as well. So, and we could talk more about things like that. Again, those sort of things have been covered in other webinars, so let's not dig into that right now. And then I mentioned that there were enhancements, so we just quickly listed what was new. Now I want to talk briefly about what's improved to existing features. So you can look forward to this after we talk about the new things. We'll talk about enhanced tracking of request and query errors and enhanced tracking of calls to external resources. And I'll explain what both of those mean if it's not obvious to you at first. We'll also see there's been improvements to the interactive step debugger. Now, some of you are going, well, what? Step debugger? Yes, so FusionReactor 6 had added a step debugger in the Ultimate Edition. When one of the first things that the Ultimate Edition added was the step debugger. And there's a whole discussion of the Ultimate Edition in another webinar, and the debugger is discussed in there. But I'll talk to you today about what's been improved in the debugger. This is one that finally, you don't have to use any interface. You don't have to worry about any particular edition. You don't have to do anything. It's just automatic, and it's pretty cool. FusionReactor 7 now automatically detects your data source names. Now, perhaps you've not even noticed what that was about, and I'll show you that when we get there, but it's a nice feature that it's automatic now. And there's more support for more frameworks, CFML and Java frameworks. And again, you may not have known that there was already support for frameworks, but there is, and there's more support for more frameworks. We'll talk about that later, as well as more support for more NoSQL data stores and streaming platforms. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so with that, let's dig in. I just want to check one more time, make sure there's no questions or comments. Okay. Okay, so first up, let's talk about those new features. And the first new feature I want to show you is this CPU sampler or CPU profiling. And you can see a screenshot here of the feature. I'll show you how to get to it in just a moment, but let's just look at this because this resolution is nice and easy for you to see. And it's a page that lists all the available threads running in the JVM. Now I'll say again, folks who maybe are focused on ColdFusion and Lucy and other CFML app servers tend to think only of requests, my URL that I asked for. But under the covers, your request runs on a thread. And the point here is that this CPU profiler looks at things from a thread level, and it shows you what threads are using the most CPU at a point in time. So when you visit this page, it just shows you right now what threads have been using the most time. And it has the thread ID, which isn't particularly interesting, but the thread name can be very interesting. And this may be a little small for some of you to read, but I'll just tell you, it might say, for instance, HTTP NIO and some port exec, or it might say HTTP bio some port and exec. And those are threads running in the case of the HTTP one, those are the built-in web server that maybe comes with ColdFusion or with Tomcat. Those run on those kind of HTTP threads, and then those of you that interact with, let's say, ColdFusion or Tomcat on Linux, or sorry, on Apache or IIS, your threads say AJP bio some port and exec. So that's just telling you the different kinds of threads, but there's lots of other threads you might see in here. And I'll go ahead and go to a live view, and let's take a look at what some of these available threads look like. So this is my particular carehart.org server, and the way you get to the CPU profiler feature is down here on the left under profiler, CPU sampler. Now again, let me repeat this point. If you come into your FusionReactor 7 or 7.1 and you don't see anything under profiler, you don't even see this button called profiler, then you don't have that Ultimate Edition that adds the profiling capability. But if you do, under profiling CPU sampler, this is how we get to that sampler. And let me just say before I go further while the screen's coming up, don't be dismayed if you think, well, goodness, I don't have Ultimate. How much of this stuff we're going to be talking about that's using Ultimate? Again, it's going to be a mix of things. Some do and some don't. If you don't currently have it, then just pay attention to what these things are. And if you decide that they seem valuable, then that's a reason to consider getting that Ultimate Edition. Anyway, I'll leave you to explore that more on your own. So back to the sampler. So here's a current live view of my display of the sampler. And again, it's in descending order of thread CPU time, both in terms of percentage and in terms of real time. Now you might see these big numbers and go, what, 61 million, what's that about? Well, in my case, my FusionReactor and particularly my Cold Fusion server that FusionReactor is monitoring has been up for 46 days. So that's why some of the numbers are really big. And if you didn't notice that, yeah, FusionReactor's metrics, web metrics, this top left thing, metrics, web metrics, when it shows you these graphs, underneath the graphs, one of the things it shows you is how long your server's been up. And yeah, this is a Windows server running Cold Fusion. And yes, it's been up for 46 days because I haven't yet had to apply or haven't yet applied Windows updates that would force me to restart. Otherwise, it stays up forever. Now, granted, it's not getting a whole lot of load. It does sometimes, and then sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, the point is if you solve your problems and you use a tool like FusionReactor, you shouldn't have to have your application server going down every night or every week, and certainly not every hour. It should be able to stay up for infinite amount of time. So anyway, back to the profiler. If we go to Profiler, CPU Sampler, everything's sortable. I could click on these and sort it and see different stuff. I could sort it by the thread information, see it sorted by the names. And where this starts to get interesting, and let's talk about why would this be even interesting. Of course, one thing was to focus on what was using the most CPU time, because you might you may already know that, for instance, you could look at requests activity, and if you had any running requests, they would be sorted, or you could sort them by duration. And within duration, there's a column underneath it that shows the CPU time. But the point is, if you wanted to focus just on what's using a lot of the CPU, that's one place where the CPU sampler is helpful. It just focuses on what's using the most CPU time. Another thing is that sometimes you're going to find out that what's using the most CPU may not be something that's directly related to one of your requests. It may be something else. And in fact, if I sort this by CPU time again, in this case, it turns out that for me, there's an aspect of FusionReactor that's doing the most CPU. Now, I want to clarify a couple things. First of all, this, remember, has been up for 40 days, so this could represent time that was in the past that has contributed to this. And we'll talk about how you can focus instead on what's going on now. But I'll also say that you might find that you don't see this on yours because maybe there's something I've enabled, or maybe I'm using a slightly different version. Maybe it's a beta that has an issue, or maybe there's even some debugging metrics turned on. And so, I've not noticed this to be the case that everybody sees this as the top user of CPU. But the bigger point is, if you're having a problem and something's going on that is using CPU within your instance. So again, we're talking about CPU within the monitored instance, let's say Cold Fusion or Lucy or your Tomcat or Jetty or Wildfly. If you've got something in there using CPU and you don't see it in the list of requests and you wonder, what is that that's using CPU? That's where the CPU sampler helps, because it doesn't focus on requests, it focuses on threads, and it does this sorting. And you could even drill into it. If you're familiar with Java, you could click this button and do a stack trace of that thread to see what that thread's doing. And you see over here, you can also try to kill the thread. You can tell it to stop or start profiling it, and pause it, and other sorts of things. So again, I'll leave you to explore that. What I want to focus on is, you might say, well, you just mentioned, Charlie, that this thing could be reflecting something from 46 days ago, since your CF has been up and running that long. How can we get it to focus on what's going on recently? Well, one way is up here at the top, this deltas button. If I click on that, that resets things and it starts just paying attention from this point forward. Okay. And so, and in fact, I had done a delta earlier, and you can see the start time is about an hour ago. Now, you can be even more specific. You can take what's called a snapshot. So I could take a snapshot, click that button, and it happens instantly, and it says snapshot generated. Click here to see it. You could click that link, or you can come over here and go to Profiler Snapshots, CPU Snapshots. Now, I had already taken a couple this morning, and now I've taken a third. And what you can do is you notice the time. So here's one from 9:26, the one we just did, and here's one I did at 8:37. And I can compare those. So I can click this one at 8:30 my time and 9:30 my time and say I want to do a difference on them. And now it focuses on what's the difference in time between those two. And it does so happen, it turns out in this case, that it is the same thing that's using 40% of or 40 milliseconds, 47 seconds of CPU time, and others have used nearly as much. So again, it's not 47%. The sum of these is way more than that. So anyway, it's there, and you could go exploring it if you wanted to. All right, so that's the CPU profiler. Let me see if there's any questions. No. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to this thread visualization. So there again, I'll just talk about the picture for a moment. So here's the thread visualizer, and same thing, it lists things by the thread ID, the thread name, the JVM thread name, and then it's got pictures and colors that represent the states, and up here you can see the states are blocked, waiting, timed waiting, and runnable, and then there's a time frame, and we're looking at the current few minutes in this particular example, couple minutes. Let's go ahead and look at a real one. So that's under resources. So instead of profiler, sampler, this one's under resources, thread visualizer. And again, this is only in certain editions. I believe it's ultimate, but it might be enterprise as well. I don't think it's standard. I'm sorry I didn't look into that. I meant to, and I forgot. I apologize. So anyway, you can explore that yourself. You'll either see it or you won't. And there's more information on the website, and I'm going to end with resources for you to learn more. So I apologize if I left any gaps. You can fill them in yourself, or I'll give you email addresses to reach out to folks and get specific answers if you have any. So don't feel like you're left hanging. All right, so here's the thread visualizer for my current carehart.org server, and here you can see the current time that's being reflected. And you can see here the columns are talking about the time spent in user time and CPU time and wait time and block time, which again reflect these different numbers up here. And I could just scroll up and down and look at them, and sometimes I might see something interesting. I can also choose to focus only on certain things. So you might remember I said that in the case of, say, Cold Fusion, the threads coming from your external web server, in my case IIS, come in on an AJP thread. So if I say AJP dash, you can already see it starting to limit what threads there are. Now yours may be AJP BIO, mine is NIO, and then it's the port. And it's at 8016. And watch it, just so you can see how this is working. There was one that said acceptor and one that said async timeout and client polar. And if I just want to focus on my actual threads running, requests from my web server to Cold Fusion, that's the connector between them. That's what this thread is that things come in on that connector, and that your CF request, in the case of CF, or your JSP request in Tomcat or Jetty, they run on a thread once they've been passed into your application. They run on this thread, and that's the thread ID. And this would be how I could focus just on those threads, and I might find over time that this would start to show some interesting pattern. In my case, it's not really showing me anything other than that requests are coming and going, and they don't take very long, but you might see something very different. And over time, this would start to have more and more information, and you can control how often it refreshes, just like any page in FusionReactor pretty much that has lists of things. There's an option for a condensed view, and I'll leave you to explore these things on your own, as well as, again, to stack trace or profile requests. So those could be interesting. And now I see a question. Would you define timed and timed waiting and waiting versus timed waiting? I'm afraid I cannot. I'll just say Google it. I've not found it to be significant enough for me to know it. And you might be stunned to hear me say that, because from things you read, you might think, well, it's got to be incredibly important. But let me just tell you that I've not yet had to come to this, for instance, to understand what was going on. It's nice that it's there, and there's certainly going to be circumstances where it might be helpful, but I have not yet had to do it, and I've not yet myself been unable to solve a problem because I didn't know this information. So, that's where these other features are so much more commonly used, the metrics web metrics, the requests activity and history, longest and slow requests, JDBC, longest and slow and active requests. So I'll just say Google it to find the answer. I'm sorry, I don't know for sure myself. The engineers certainly would, and these are pure JVM things, so certainly if you Google it, you'll find the answer. But I just don't know. I'm not going to try to fake an answer. I'll just say it just hasn't really mattered to me, and I'm okay with that. Okay, so that's the thread visualization. Now, this is where things get interesting for some people, as they have long wished they could do heap profiling. And again, JVM tools could give you that capability, but they were often difficult to set up, and so you ended up not knowing, well, why was the heap full? And just to back up for folks who may be a little bit new to this, the heap is one part of the JVM memory. And by the way, the JVM memory is just one part of your process's memory. So I find a lot of people use tools like Windows Task Manager or Top in Linux to see how much, quote, memory is ColdFusion using. Well, you just should understand that the memory you see for the process is comprised of various things, one of which is the JVM memory. And then the JVM memory is itself comprised of various things, one of which is the heap. And this is a profile of the heap. And it so happens that the heap is usually the biggest user of memory within the JVM, and that JVM memory is usually the biggest user of memory within your process. So I'm just being clear that this is not looking at all the memory used in your process, nor is it looking at every aspect of your memory use in the JVM. It's focused on the heap. And in fact, let me make this point even more clear, because this is a surprise for some people, and they didn't know they could do this. Up here under resources, well, actually, let me back up even further just to really make this point, drive it home. If I go to metrics web metrics, which is where a lot of people come and hang out and watch things, first I'm saying that up here in the top right corner, this is the heap use. So even FusionReactor's metrics web metrics does presume that the most important thing you want to focus on is the heap. So here's the heap, and you may have all found on your own that this has 3 numbers in it. As I mouse over it, you can see there's the heap used in the bottom in darkest orange, then the heap allocated, which is usually a little bit more in a lighter orange, and then the max, in my case, whatever my heap size is set to, and I believe mine's set to a gig. Again, I don't need a lot of memory because my stuff works well and I can get by with just a gig. You might have 10 gig, you might have more, but the point is you can see the current used, allocated, and max heap here. But if it was ever high, you might be a little bit panicky and wonder, oh my gosh, what's happening in that heap? Why is it full? So we're going to talk about how the tool can help you to see it. Now, before I do go to that, let me show you something that's important also to note. When we see that heap, and it looks to me like it's 600 out of 900, which is like 66, 70% in my case. And by the way, if you didn't know it, if you scroll down here, you can see the percentage, and sure enough, it was 69, and it just dropped to 62. But anyway, when you see that memory high and you worry about it, before you freak out and think, oh my gosh, it's going to die, there is a button here called garbage collection. And unless you've got JVM arguments that stop a garbage collection from being able to be requested, I'm going to click that button right now, and let's just see if that memory goes down on its own. So I'm just waiting a moment. It should usually only take a matter of seconds. And it says it recovered 48 meg. And that's not much. It didn't go down too much. Now, I've had other people, I do this all the time with people, and we do that, and it drops down to 10% or 20%. My point is, when you see the memory high, even in the heap, before you think, oh, I need to understand that, well, first of all, if you do a garbage collection and it only drops a little, then yes, you need to understand, in my case, why is it still nearly 600 meg out of my gig? Something's using it. And let me also say, for those that might freak out a bit at the idea of doing a GC, you can see I did it right here, and the CPU went up to about 60, 70%, but my request times didn't jump up dramatically. So don't believe everybody that says, oh, you never want to click a garbage collection button or request a GC because it'll stop the world and hang up your server. Maybe it will, but in most cases I've found it doesn't. It just takes a little bit of CPU, and it might hang up requests for just a moment and not really be a big deal. So anyway, I was saying that if you want to understand what's in the heap, first I want you to be aware that the heap is just one part of many parts of the JVM memory. You might someday get an out of memory condition and it's not in the heap, and this display is only focused on the heap. So over here under resources, in FusionReactor resources, is memory spaces. and also heap, non-heap. But let me focus on memory spaces and show you that you can see a breakdown of every part of the JVM memory. And the heap is primarily composed in depends on different garbage collection algorithms and JVM versions, but it's usually the Eden space, the survivor space, and the old gen. Those are what make up the heap. And there's 3 different parts to the heap. And then there's other non-heap memory spaces like the meta space, or what in Java 7 was called the perm gen, and the compressed class space and the code cache. So I just want you to see that FusionReactor lets you see all these parts of memory within the JVM. It doesn't let you see what's going on in other parts of memory that are not in the JVM. And then specifically, the memory profiler is actually specifically a heap profiler. So if we look over here at memory, it does say view heap. So it does remind you that this is about the heap. And this will be showing you what we saw a moment ago in the graph. So here's my current heap analysis, and you see how quickly it came up. It's not like it takes forever to come up or anything like that, even if it was a big heap. It comes up very quickly. And what it does is it tells us when the heap snapshot, as it were taken, this moment in time, when was it done? And actually it's refreshing, or can be made to refresh, just like any other page. And we can see how many classes in Java were there, and how many objects, which are instances of classes, and how much heap is used, and the percentage. And it's fluctuating in the 50 to 60% range for me. The bigger thing is that it starts to now break down what objects in memory are using the most heap. You can see the object names, the class names here, and the size of the objects and the number of the objects. This is the number of the objects, and this is their size. And then this is a percentage, and it defaults to sorting it by that percentage of size, so we can focus on, okay, what is using the most. And it's not unusual to see it say char for character and byte for byte, and laying double for a double, which is just a number. And that's not useful, I'll grant, for everybody. That might leave you going, what can I do with that? Hold your thought, there's more to be done. So one thing I want you to see is that this, again, is what it is right now. What we might really wonder is, how does it vary over time? Like, I might wonder if I could compare what it's like now to when I run something that I think is causing a lot of problems, and I want to run that thing and then compare the memory use then to now. Well, just like in the profiler, the CPU profiler, we had a snapshot feature. Same thing here, we have a snapshot feature. Now, I'm going to take a snapshot, but I'll remind you that idea of taking a garbage collection first, and FusionReactor even offers a button here to say do a garbage collection. And the term force GC is really no different than the garbage collection button on the metrics web metrics. They both request the JVM to take a garbage collection, and unless you have JVM arguments that tell the JVM not to allow anything to request one, this will request one. And the point is, the reason why it's here is, before you take the snapshot, it would be in your interest to go ahead and do a force GC to make sure that whatever's in memory now is just what's really currently in use. And I know I didn't go into that in more depth, but the point is, when you do the GC, all that's left in memory is what's currently in use. Anything that's no longer in use has been let go. That's garbage. That's why it's called garbage collection. So by having done a force of the GC and now take a snapshot, we know that the snapshot, which again is instant, is reflecting the current state of things without any garbage. Whatever is in that snapshot is the current use of memory that's currently in use, objects that really are in use. And again, this is not the session to get into memory analysis. We've had other webinars where we've covered that, but often what's holding memory is something that lives a long time, actually. It turns out to not usually be about some particular request, and it might be sessions, and it might be the application scope and server scope for those that are CFML developers. The session scope applies to Java as well as CFML. It might be caching that you're doing in the address space. So the point is, whatever you've got that's living a long time, that's usually what's, quote, holding memory. People tend to think it's a leak, but a leak implies nobody can understand why it's happening and it's a bug. In my experience, it's not usually a leak, but it's instead something you didn't understand. It might be session variables or application variables or query caching or the like. Anyway, I've been talking to give us some time for me to now take another snapshot. And technically, the good practice would be to take this GC, which again only takes a moment, and then do the snapshot. And now you're really going to compare just two that had all their objects that were junk removed, and all that was left is what was really in use. Now, I could have clicked the button while it was there to get to that, but I can also come down here and go to memory snapshots, and there will be the two that I took, and I can look at them individually, but more importantly, I can compare them. And now, again, I'm seeing just the difference between the two snapshots and what objects used the most memory between those. What was the increase? So here you can see what size increased or what number of objects increased. And I could change to say, show me what number of objects increased the most, or I can say, show me what objects in memory in terms of size increased the most. And it so happens in my case right now that there's nothing jumping out. And I would just say that's because I don't currently have any problems where something jumps out. You'll often see something more interesting will jump out. Now, when you find something, you see that there's a link underneath here. You can click on that thing. And if it was a Java thing that you had responsibility for and you wanted to understand it, you could decompile it. That's what that link does. Now, if I go back to the display, remember if we go back, for instance, either to the heap snapshots, I said I could click on them here, or if I just go back to the current profile, either one, you'll see that there's not only that link to be able to dig into them, but there's also this feature over here that says, show me the GC roots. Show me the GC roots. And I'll leave you to explore more on your own because we can't make this be all a session about doing garbage collection analysis. But with that, it would try to find the GC roots. Now, it complained that it timed out after 1,000 milliseconds, and I have to click here to run it again with a double timeout. And this is all just part of avoiding things taking up too much resources. Or you can come in here and change the timeout setting. And again, I'll leave that for you all to dig into. I don't want to get into that depth. That's not really the focus of this presentation. I wanted you all who understand what this is about to see that the capabilities were there. And then if you already understand it, go to town. If you don't understand it and you need more help, again, I'm going to point you to resources when we end, including documentation. And if you still don't understand something after that, then again, I'll give you email addresses to reach out to support or sales to ask questions. Okay, so let's move on to the JMX metric monitoring. So that again is a new feature in 7. And I said it's just a whole bunch of metrics that the JVM keeps track of for you under the covers, JMX Metrics. And this picture doesn't really, it's a little bit fuzzy, so I'll go ahead and look at mine. Now, it's under metrics, JMX beans, and JMX overview, and JMX graphs. So if I come up here to JMX beans, that's what that picture was showing you. And I see all these different categories of JMX beans. So just don't worry about beans. It just means objects. And there's different categories of objects. And there's ones that come with Java. And then there's some that come with FusionReactor. You don't usually need to worry about looking into the FusionReactor ones. But Catalina is about that connector between the web server and Cold Fusion. So there's interesting stuff in this Catalina set of objects, and you can learn more about the connector, and you might recognize these ports as being the connector thread, the connector IDs, the connector ports. So you could dig into those. I'll just pick one for an example, and it shows me some of the things that are configurable, and it also has some things that reflect status of information, and different things in here have different levels of information about different things. So for instance, if I come to this thread pool. So again, if you missed it, I went to thread pool and the AJP NIO, in my case, 8016. Now I can see in here things like how many threads are running, how many connections are there, how many are busy. And then furthermore, if I'd like to be able to keep an eye on these, you notice a little play button over here. If I were to click that, it would change to looking like this. And what this does is that puts it into that graph that I said if we look up at the top, there's metrics, JMX, overview, and graphs. So whatever I've clicked the play button on, I would now be able to more easily look at. It's kind of like setting favorites. And now I'm just seeing those that I said, hey, I want to pay close attention to these. And you can see the different ones I've done. there's that thread pool connections count. And then there's other Catalina things that were interesting to me. And not only does that let me see, them to be reminded how to get to them, but then I could click on this graph page, and now I'm looking at, in my case, the count of errors that have happened in that connector over the course of a day or an hour or a week. And fortunately, I have a little bit of increase in errors over time. So anyway, I'll leave you to explore that. You also see up here, you can choose from the drop-down list of the ones that you basically marked as favorites. So it makes it really easy for you to look at important JMX beans that you might learn about, either know about on your own or learn about from other folks sharing with you. So the JMX Metrics is a pretty cool feature. And then the CloudWatch, and I'll just leave this at saying there are many things you can send to CloudWatch, many things, about 150 metrics that you can send to CloudWatch. And I'll just show you that up here under metrics is AWS CloudWatch metrics. And here are all the different metrics. You'll recognize some of those being things that you've seen in FusionReactor for a long time. And this list just goes on and on and on with 150 items that I could say I want to send to my CloudWatch instance. Now, first, let me just tell you, you can search things in here. So for instance, if I wanted to focus on CFC requests, I could track those particularly. That's HTTP-based request for a CFC, for those that know that distinction. Anyway, you can limit this search however you want. And so far as where would the CloudWatch be, you click this configure button and configure the CloudWatch setup. And again, I'll leave you to look at the docs for more on that. So let's move on. We're getting towards the last 15 minutes. And I'm going to go a little bit over since we started a little bit late. I hope folks can stick around for a couple more minutes. So as far as the enhancements are concerned, first of all, there's enhanced tracking of requests and query errors. So you could easily miss this if you weren't paying attention. First of all, if you look at metrics, web metrics, there's now a new legend up here that says errors. And in queries, there's errors. And in error time and error time for requests and error time for queries. These are just new points. Now, I don't have any errors happening right now, but the point is if you did, you'd see a red line and it would be going up or down relative to the number of errors you had or how much time was being spent in error requests. So that's pretty cool. You can also dig right into the errors by going to requests, error history. So this just goes right to any errors that have happened that had any requests that have happened that had errors. And it so happens, as you can see, I haven't had an error since this morning at 8 a.m. and only 2 today, and then a couple on the 17th and so on. So I can always look at them this way as well and dig into what they're about. And if you haven't noticed it, if you look at a request that had an error, when you click on the details, there's an error details. And so I can see what the error was, and there was somebody asking for a file that didn't exist. So FusionReactor has captured what the error was in the request. This isn't new. It's always had these error details if a request had an error. What's new is the way to easily see what requests have had errors, okay? And you can also just go right to the error by clicking this button. And you can see that also in the request history or longest requests, for instance. And I know I see that there are very long running requests. Sure enough, there it was. And there's the link to error. These ones were long, but they didn't have errors, so they don't have a link to go to the error. But this one was long and it had an error. Okay, so that's that. And the same ability in the JDBC. And we saw that. And then there's a new feature to track calls to external resources, and you could easily miss this, so I really want to highlight this. Some of you know that a CF, in case of CFML, your CFML request could do a CF HTTP to some third-party server, or you could have a JSP or servlet or Spring app that does an HTTP client call out to a third-party server. So if you come to transactions, external resources, so again, I'll leave my mouse here to see transactions, external sources. This focuses on calls to whatever domain name you might have called in your application. So you can see different ones that my application is called. But the point is you could come up here and pick some URL that you know your requests are calling out to frequently. I'll just pick one randomly. And then you can say, do I want to focus on the calls to that thing from within my app in the last minute, hour, or since your instance started? So I'm going to pick since my instance started, and look at this. FusionReactor breaks down the percentage of time it spent in different methods and how many times those methods were called, and then how many different types of URLs within that domain got called. And then even more powerful is down here. You can see how many times a call to a given URL on that selected domain, how many times have they happened, how long did they take, and so on. So that's really cool, right? Calls to external resources, much more control over that now. And then I mentioned the auto detection of data source names. Let me just show you what I'm talking about there. You could have easily missed that this was an option that you didn't even notice was a possibility. I'm going to click the JDBC History. So the JDBC History shows me what queries have run in the past on my server. And what I'm talking about is the ability to see what data source it is. You can see right there, it tells me the data source name. You maybe never noticed that that wasn't there, and you maybe, if you're on a new version of 7, you haven't noticed that it is now there. It used to be that in order to get to know what data source this query was, you had to put a connection string into the data source definition, whether in CF or Lucy or in your JDBC configuration for Java. You had to put a connection string in to say, hey, FusionReactor, here's my data source name. But it's able to figure that out now. Now, let me show you where this could be even more compelling. Well, let's say I go to requests, history, or in my case, I'm going to look at longest requests, because I know I just had one that took a long time. I'm going to look at the details of it. And many of you know that if you have a request and you're looking at the details, you can go to the JDBC tab and you can see what query ran. Well, I'm saying that that too tells you now the data source automatically. So however you're looking at a request and its queries, the point is you can now see what data source is. And you might go, come on, that's nothing to celebrate. Well, it is if you've always lamented that you couldn't see what the data source was and you maybe didn't know that it was configurable. Now it's just automatic. So you don't have to worry about it. It's just there for you automatically. And then I'll just say, for those interested in Docker, FusionReactor now has automatic detection of Docker and integration with Docker. And there's a couple of resources that you can look into. And if you just Google FusionReactor Docker, you'll find these. But you'll have this recording to watch later. And if you want to, you can even ask for a PDF of the slides if you want. I don't believe we post them anywhere, but if it would be helpful, if you were to ask the sales address that I'll show you at the end, I'm sure they would send it to you. Anyway, here's a video that Brad Wood did on integration of FusionReactor and Docker, and it's really compelling to see how, as you spin up Docker instances, they just automatically become available to be monitored by a central FusionReactor enterprise dashboard, and so on. I also want to point out that you can now pause requests, but that's really a facet of the step debugger, and I mentioned that in passing earlier, so let's talk about that. The step debugger is a feature, again, in FusionReactor Ultimate, and it used to be that you would set a breakpoint primarily by pointing to a line of code in a particular template, just like in any debugger, and then you would turn on the debugger in FusionReactor, and you would run the request, and it would be intercepted when it hit that line of code. Well, now you can also just set a breakpoint, as it were, automatically, dynamically, by just clicking on a request that's running and debug it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to start off on a screen you guys can't see. I'm going to start off a request that is going to take a while. I'll make it take about 20 seconds so we can catch it. Okay, so if we come up here to my requests activity, we'll now see it running. Here it is, taking a long time. And I'm saying you can now debug it. It's not obvious, it just says pause thread, but if I click it, I'm actually, and notice it changed to the bug icon, I'm actually enabling the debugger. And that, if for those who've seen the debugger before, you get this icon saying there's a thread that's being intercepted. Do you want to debug it? And if I click on that button, I can come over here and debug it. And again, the other webinars talk about all the aspects of the debugger and pausing and how many threads get paused and how you can control that. Save that for another time. I'm just saying that one request, I caught it running and I said, hey, what are you doing? And I paused it, and it let me see that I could go to the debugger, and I can click on this debug icon and drop right into the FusionReactor debugger. Now, it so happens that it was in the midst of doing a pretty low-level Java thing, a socket read, and the socket input stream object. But the point is, FusionReactors let me drop right in there and see that. Now, I don't particularly care to see the Java code, and it doesn't let me do it over the external web server. That's not important. But what is important is if I just scroll down a little bit, I can also see eventually, if you know about stack traces, and I've covered this in other webinars, this is a stack trace of that request at that moment, and it's actually running this line of code. In my case, in this inetpub www root load test template directory is this thing called longdbwait. And if I click on this, check this out. It shows me the line of code. This was the line of code that was running. It dropped me right into the debugger at the line of code that was running. Now you can look at this and go, oh, I see what you're doing there. Yeah, I'm using an available SQL Server thing called wait for delay for some number of minutes or seconds. And I was just doing that to artificially create a long running request. But this could have been your query taking a long time, and you would be able to drop in and go, oh, the reason this request is slow right now is it's at this line of code. And the debugger can be very helpful because you could look at the value of variables at this point, not just know that it's running that, but you can see what variables and what different scope variables and the CGI scope and the session scope. And if I was in a method of a CFC, I could see the method's local scope and the CFC's this scope and so on and so on. So that's a pretty compelling improvement. And if you were looking at threads in those various thread pages I showed you earlier, they also had that pause button. So you could debug a thread at any point and say, hey, what are you doing, thread? And dig into the debugger and maybe figure it out. There is improvements to viewing variables. I didn't want to go into this in detail because we're running out of time, but I'll say especially for those that use the debugger, there is now the ability to watch variables. So instead of just stepping through code and looking for a variable, you can just tell it to watch a particular variable and it will stay in the interface, always visible to you. So here's watches. And I set these earlier for other requests so they don't apply to this particular one. But the point is, if I told it to watch any particular variable name, it would be there and I could always view it as I'm stepping through my code. And you can, sorry, that should say step through. You can step through stacked frames, and that's what I did when I showed you that I dug down into here and I said, show me this particular thing. Well, I could go back even further. If again, I don't want to get into too much weeds here, but if this had been called by some other, let's say CFML thing, let's say this had been included by some CF thing or been called as a CFC method, I could eventually find that other CFM or CFC reference down here and click on that, and I'd now be looking at the values of the variables when it was back in that point, before it got to this point. So that's about stack traces and stack frames, and that may be a bit much for some people to get, so we'll cover that in a future update to the debugger presentation, but we don't have time to get into that now. And then you saw that it was able to help me see when triggers are pending. Oh, and there's some new information you saw a little bit there. So I'll just leave it at that. I got to move on. I want to repeat the point that the cool thing about this debugger, for those who maybe weren't paying attention earlier, is notice I'm just sitting in FusionReactor's web interface in the browser, looking at my website. I'm not loading up into Eclipse or CF Builder or any other IDE. I'm just using the web interface to literally step through my code. And again, this is secure because you have to be logged into FusionReactor, and you can even limit who's using FusionReactor, who's allowed to do what. And again, that's covered in other presentations about how there's different classes of users in FusionReactor, and you can limit who's allowed to do some things and who's not allowed to do other things. So about the debugger, I just want to point out there's a couple resources. One is one is the webinar, and that's getting the most out of FusionReactor Ultimate. So again, if you just Google FusionReactor webinars, you'll find the list of webinars, and this is one of those dozen webinars. There's also an article called Why Every Developer Needs FusionReactor's Production Debugger. And again, you can just Google FusionReactor Debugger, and it should come up among the top results, but if it doesn't, there's the URL for that. There's also, as I said, support for new platforms. So it already supported ColdBox, Struts, Spring, and Play, and now it also supports Framework 1 and Fusebox. And then there was already now there is support for Mongo, Cassandra, and Redison as NoSQL stores, and then Apache Kafka. So I'll just say that for those who know what those things are, they're now supported. And there's a little bit more on Kafka. So if you just Google FusionReactor Kafka, you'll find this article. And then just other enhancements that I wanted to say in passing. For those that use the FusionReactor Cloud, which we'll talk about in a moment before we wrap up, there is now a link in the FusionReactor Cloud interface to be able to readily see how to get to the cloud web page. So there's a link called Open Cloud. Again, you won't even see this icon if you don't have FusionReactor Cloud, but it used to be just this. And if you didn't know the URL to get to your cloud interface, you were stuck. Well, now you can click that button and get to your cloud interface. If you try to look at a request in the requests history, you may know this only shows the 100 most recent requests. Well, if I go to the very bottom and try to look at the 100th oldest request, by the time I click on it, I know I've had other requests, so I'm going to get an error. And it now says a nicer, sorry, this web request is no longer available. Click here to find out about how to increase how many can be shown. So again, if you know what that's about, it's just a friendlier response. There's now WebSocket compression up to the cloud that could benefit some people. There's coming support for closure. And then 7 had added some improved control over transaction naming and automatic detection of frameworks so that it showed you more useful information in the interface about transactions within requests. And there's a whole discussion of that, and I'll leave you to look into that. You can come back and see that URL later. There's automatic obfuscation now of credit card data, which is very important for some people. So it won't show up on the screen, won't show up in the logs, won't be sent to the cloud if it looks like a credit card number. For those on Lucy, there is now support for the line performance feature. That's not something people use very often. It's been there for CF for a couple of releases. Again, you can Google FusionReactor line performance and read more about that on your own. It has some overhead, so be aware of it. And that's why I don't tend to talk about it too much, because it's perhaps too much for some people. If you do manual activation, things have gotten a lot better. So I'll just say that if you ever have to do manual activation, there's some improvements to that. And basically, I want to make sure you understand this, is that there have been hundreds of bug fixes and performance improvements between 7.0 and 7.08 and then into 7.1. So I just want to stress again, if you're on a 7.0 and never updated, before you complain about something, get on the latest version, because there could be a bug fix or a performance improvement that took care of an issue that you're suffering, and it's there for you to just go get it and apply it. And here's a link to the tech note for 7 and 7.1 that lists what was new in each point release of 7.0 and what's new in 7.1. And not just what's new, but what's improved and what bug fixes there have been. All right, and I mentioned that the cloud has been released. So the cloud edition, and again, there's a whole webinar on it, so I'm going to take a minute or two to talk about it. The cloud is an extension to FusionReactor, which provides its own web interface that lets you see information that you might not so readily see in your local deployment of FusionReactor. Let me explain it with these words here. So it's a cloud-based repository and an alternative interface for looking at FusionReactor. You still have your FusionReactor on-premise, but that FusionReactor sends data up to the cloud, and FusionReactor Cloud is a web-based service that you just get if you sign up for it, and it retains the data over much longer periods of time than FusionReactor does. Now, you notice my server had been up for 46 days, so some of you know that you could see as far back as a week. If your instance has been up for as much as a week, you can see far back as a week. But you've perhaps also noticed that if your instance goes down 2 hours ago, and you look at FusionReactor, there's nothing in there about what happened prior to 2 hours ago. Now, I did a whole webinar on post-crash troubleshooting with FusionReactor, because there's far more information available than you may realize in the logs and alerts. But the point of FusionReactor Cloud is it's sending this data up all the time to the cloud implementation. And if you had the cloud version and you had your instance go down, you could look at the cloud version of FusionReactor and see in its interface what happened 2 hours ago, 3 hours ago, 5 hours ago, a day ago, a week ago, and even up to 90 days, depending on the level of FusionReactor Cloud you buy, as to how many days of retention are kept. And then more importantly, there's some additional features, including some powerful application aggregation, and then especially some advanced alerting capabilities. Now, this can be very important to some people. So let me talk about a couple of these. So there was that point about up to 90 days. The enhanced alerting, it can do alerting on a lot more conditions than FusionReactor does. Now, here's why. FusionReactor, as you have it and has always been, runs inside your JVM. So it's got to be tight. It's got to be, kind of provide the most it can. And it's amazing how much it does, but it all runs in your JVM. It has to have low overhead, and it has virtually no overhead. And you maybe never even noticed it have overhead, and it shouldn't. But my point is, it's running inside your JVM. FusionReactor, as you've always known it, is. And with the cloud, it's still running in the JVM, but it's also pushing stuff up to the cloud. Well, whatever they want to add to FusionReactor inside the JVM, they have to weigh the cost, because it's going to have an impact on your JVM. but they can add things to the cloud version because it's running up there in the cloud. They control the servers. They, uh, allocate the CPU and memory and disk. So it's up to FusionReactor engineers to decide what to add and how to pay for it, as it were, in terms of providing that capability. So they've added, for instance, lots more alerting conditions, because that takes time and effort and drop-down lists and tracking data for longer periods of time over time, so that they can throw these alerts. And then you can also not only alert on more conditions, but you can also do more than just send an alert to an email, which is the current FusionReactor Crash Protection Alert can just send an email, but the FusionReactor Cloud can do email, or it can do PagerDuty, Slack, HipChat, and more. And again, sure, they could have done that in FusionReactor on-premise, but to put all that capability in there would have added weight to the FusionReactor that runs inside your JVM. So they're trying to keep it light and tight and mean and lean and run well, and it does. And they're adding more and more functionality to the cloud, because that's where they can add this capability and not have an impact on you. So if you learn more about the cloud, there's a whole website, section of the website devoted to it. If you just Google FusionReactor Cloud, you'll find this. And then there's the webinar, and there's the URL for it. But again, if you just go to FusionReactor webinars, you'll find it listed in there as an early 2017 webinar done by David Tattersall, the CTO. And it's a really good presentation. So other resources about 7 and 7.1 besides the docs, I just want to list a few here. There was a thing announcing it and listing some features. There's that release notes. There's various discussions about the profiler, the CPU profiler, the memory profiler, the debugger. There's a feature panel. If you've never seen this, go check it out, regardless of whatever version you're on. And regardless of whether you're interested in new features or not, go look at the feature panel, because it covers pretty much all the features of FusionReactor and has nice little buttons that you can click on, and it pops up and shows you things in particular places. So it's very useful, and I think underutilized, because you may not know it's even there. All right, so like I said, I wanted to go just a few minutes beyond. We're at 8 minutes beyond. Let me try to wrap up. So lots of new and improved features. They extend FusionReactor's long existing abilities to help you with troubleshooting, tuning, and problem resolution. We've seen things like the heap and CPU profiling, the JMX Metrics, and more. And again, these are all accessible within the browser, as opposed to needing to use any third-party tools or tweaks to the JVM. And we've seen lots of enhancements to existing features. And I just want to say this, always watch out when you're using FusionReactor to see if something might be different, because you may not bother to read the release notes, but you might see, oh, I didn't know I could do this. I used to not be able to do it. Oh, now I can do it. So just always watch out for that. It's a web application. You might notice things change, and there's some new capability that you missed out on. But again, go to that release notes to learn more. And that's why we do these talks about what's new. And then remember that updating is free. If you're on subscription, or if you have current maintenance, you can upgrade to 7.0 or 7.1 for free. And it's an in-place upgrade. Very easy to do. I've mentioned the other webinars. There's the URL for it. Just fusionreactor.com/webinars. It's easy enough. You can register for any newly added ones, and you can watch the recordings of the past ones that we've had. And then finally, if you have questions and want to find more resources, there's the website with lots of information. Here's the email addresses for sales and support. Very easy to remember, sales at and support at. And there's a phone number, which is more for sales than support. There's also available consulting assistant through a sister site called cfconsultant.com. And of course, we do welcome your feedback on these webinars and any you'd like to see in the future.